Hello dear friends, you are on the Ruslan Belov channel and this is the Daily Combat Report. The war continues and you and I continue to study the situation at the front. And so, friends, over the past day there were also many advances. Moreover, a number of advances were extremely important. And you know, I personally expected that the pace in October would slow down significantly. I thought the pace would be 1.5 times lower than the summer values. But no, the Russian army is pushing forward at the same level. And, as I already said, the advances were very good. In one sector, the AFU simply howled, asking their command to withdraw them because they are essentially under a blockade, and there are quite a few of them there. We are talking about 500 or even a little more soldiers, but let's talk about everything in order. And let's start today with the Sumy region. Yes, unexpectedly. Here the Russian army has made advances. For the entire month, the front line here stood motionless. But now, even in such a dead section, the AFU has had setbacks. Yes, small and not critical, but still. The Russian soldiers advanced here in the area between Kondratovka and Alexeyevka. The advance was more than 800 meters, and the direction here is towards Andreevka. The village was already under Russian control, but in the summer the AFU recaptured it. And now, thanks to this advance from the current positions to the village, there are 1 kilometer 200 meters remaining. We also had an advance in the area of Yunakovka. Well, rather, from the village, and the advance here was in two directions. To the south towards Krapovshchina. They advanced here by 900 meters, but it's still a long way to Krapovshchina, of course. The distance here is 3 kilometers 700 meters. Plus, they also advanced to the east towards the orchards. And here the advance was 650 meters. And to the orchards from the current positions is 2 kilometers 700 meters. In general, what else can be said about the Sumy region? Not much, really. We are slowly trying to probe the AFU positions, and we are holding our own line of defense. If in the summer the AFU was successful here, and they advanced somewhere, recaptured something, pushed us back, now they are not succeeding at all. And as you can see, on the contrary, things have started to move for us. Let's move on. To the Kharkiv region, the battles for two cities continue there, Volchansk and Kupiansk, and news of advances is coming from Volchansk. Here, please, take a look. Here the guys managed to advance on both sides of the railway. In the western part of the city, they advanced 700 meters along Oboznaya Street, taking part of Yaroslava Mudrogo and Ozernaya streets along the way. Here, as you can see, they took control of part of Proletarskaya Street, and also took a whole block of high-rise buildings. In general, a very good advance, if we are talking specifically about the Volchansk sector. And in general, lately, if you have noticed from the reports, the Volchansk sector has really come alive. We receive reports of advances from here almost every day, and at the moment the Russian army controls almost 70% of the city. In fact, there is only one very small block of high-rise buildings left on the Rubezhanskoye highway. And that's it. And the rest is the private sector. I don't want to give any false hopes, of course, but there is a chance that by the end of the year, Volchansk will be under full Russian control. At least the prerequisites for this exist. As I have already said, they have constantly, on a regular basis, begun to move here. Let's move on with you to what is perhaps the main news of the past day. And so, we are not finished with the Kharkiv region yet. Yesterday, there was a magnificent advance on the left bank of the Oskol River of 4.5 kilometers. You remember, not so long ago I told you in an episode that we managed to occupy the village of Peshanoye. So now the soldiers have managed to advance 4.5 kilometers from it, entering Kurilovka. And Kurilovka, you can see it on the map, is a very large village. For your understanding, before the war, 3,600 people lived here. So the Russian soldiers managed not just to enter Kurilovka and gain a foothold somewhere on the outskirts and in houses. No, here they entered and advanced along Polovaya Street deep into the village for more than 2 kilometers through a residential area. Well, and this is not just someone's statement. There were objective control footage from here where Russian soldiers are hanging the Russian flag on a house. Moreover, you know, from the footage it is clear that they are doing it calmly, without fear of anything. This gives reason to believe that Russian control in the village is much greater than is even drawn here on the map. And, in general, an interesting configuration of the front is now emerging here, since there is now a very solid pocket with Petropavlovka in the center, and the area of this pocket is more than 70 kilometers. But the point is not even in the area of the pocket, but in the fact that the AFU here turned out to be, well, de facto trapped. They say so themselves. That is, these are not my words. Yesterday I quoted from Ukrainian resources, any crossings that they build across the Oskol are taken out by the Russian army within an hour. Can you imagine? They themselves say they were simply trapped here, and the garrison, the number of which is still here, is more than 500 people. I mean only about this pocket. I'm not talking about Kupiansk, Uzlovoy and so on. In general, an interesting situation is emerging, and as for, by the way, Kupiansk, Uzlovoy, thanks to this breakthrough, the Russian positions are now only 4 kilometers from this urban-type settlement. Why did everything start to fall apart for the AFU here, although before that they had held their positions not just for months, but de facto for years? It's all about Kupiansk. Now the AFU is throwing everything they have there just to hold the city, and they have basically given up on the left bank. That's why everything started to fall apart for them here. I am sure that it will only get worse, and if they do not withdraw their garrison from the left bank, they will undoubtedly fall into a trap. Yes, they have essentially already fallen. And we are moving on with you to the Siversk direction. Here yesterday we analyzed the Russian advances to the north of the city. The soldiers occupied Dronovka, and over the past day they managed to advance to the south of Siversk. The movement was to the west of Vyemka, along the railway. They advanced in this way by 1 kilometer 800 meters. Well, and of course, the immediate task will not even be to reach Siversk, but to straighten the front and close the resulting pocket. And by the way, this is also important in order to begin to exert pressure on Zvanovka, not only from the south, but also from the east. Especially considering that yesterday the Russian soldiers made an attempt to enter Zvanovka. I do not have information yet as to whether it was successful or not, but I know that they tried to enter. And the capture of Zvanovka is extremely important for the complete blockade of Siversk from the south and control over one of the 2 remaining logistics routes. And I remind you that there are only 2 roads left here. This is this one through Sviato-Pokrovskoye and from the side of Liman. If they are taken under control, Siversk is finished. Well, and as you can see, here also south of Novosilovka, they have advanced, and from the current positions, it is now less than 1.5 kilometers to the southern outskirts of Siversk. In general, everything is moving towards its logical conclusion. But the most surprising and unexpected thing happened to the south, in the area of Kostyantynivka. And what I did not expect at all happened. Yes, what in principle probably no one expected. Russian troops managed to break into Kostyantynivka, and not just to enter some, outskirts and houses, but to penetrate deep into the city. The advance deep into the city was more than 1 kilometer. The following streets were taken under control. I will list them for you now. Kamenaya, Tashkentskaya, Yaroslavskaya, Kostromskaya, Arkhangelskaya, Gomelskaya, Adlerskaya, Vladimirskaya, Nakimova, and Volогодskaya. That is, 10 streets in Kostyantynivka are already under Russian control. Plus, the Russian army partially controls 5 more streets. These are Trudovaya, International Naya, Magistral Naya, Samarkandskaya and Volkovskaya streets. But what is the attempt on the Russian side now? It is, of course, to fully consolidate and reach Sobornosti Street in order to take this entire part of Kostyantynivka under control. Well, and already, relying on this part of the city, if it is possible, again, to really consolidate fully, then it will be possible to begin to put pressure on the central part. But at the same time, I personally will urge you not to be too complacent. The city is very large. Just look at the map. It is twice as large in area as the same Pokrovsk, and the pre-war population here was under 100,000 people. Well, that is, in general, if we do not take into account the cities that the Russian army occupied in the spring of 2022. This will be the largest city in terms of area and population for which the fighting has begun. And with such an entry, they have obviously begun. So you can mark somewhere for yourself that on October 24th, Russian troops began the battle for Kostyantynivka. But, again, I will repeat, and I personally do not expect much progress here, and there will be none. Well, there will be none until the Russian army cuts the main supply artery. This is the highway from the side of Sloviansk-Druzhkovka. And this means that it is necessary either to pull up positions from the side of Poltavka or from the side of Chasov Yar, and preferably simultaneously from both there and there. But so far, there are problems with this. Nothing is moving at all in the Chasov Yar area, and there have been no advances in the Poltavka area for a long time. Therefore, they occupied a number of streets. Good. But you can't storm the whole city like that. It's too big and has a large industrial zone. Therefore, we are waiting for the flanks to become more active. Let's move on. In other cities, we have progress in Mirnograd. Here, the fighters from the east managed to enter the city and enter successfully. At least objective control footage appeared from the area of the Dimitrov mine, and the production facilities of the mine are already under Russian control, as are a number of streets on the eastern side. These are Nakimov, Kutuzov, Suvorov, Chernyakovsky, Lermontov, Stepnaya and Yesenina and Shakhterskaya streets. Significant progress. The goal here is to cut off the southern part of Mirnograd, dividing the city into two parts and clearing the southern part. That is, the goal is to do something like this. Whether it will work out or not, we will see. Also, news is coming from Pokrovsk. The German propagandist Julian Röpke is agonizing that the logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine in Pokrovsk have broken down, and now the AFU is forced to hold on to the city for political reasons, although from a military point of view it would be better to withdraw forces from there. For the Russian army, this state of affairs is more than satisfactory. Ukrainian logistics are suffering severely. They are losing a lot of forces in supplying the city, and for such intense hostilities, simply enormous resources are needed. The Russian army will continue to tighten the pincers around the city, and it is very interesting how this will all end. Whether the Ukrainian forces will break out of the encirclement or decide to repeat the situation with Mariupol, and instead of leaving, remain inside the city to fight to the end. For the Russian side, the only downside to this is that the city will be severely destroyed, more so than if they decide to withdraw their forces in the near future. Plus, there was also an advance, well, you could say, in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Mezhevskoye, Novopavlovsk direction. I don't know how to correctly designate it here. In general here, you see they advanced here, cleared a small remnant in the Donetsk region, and entered the Dnipropetrovsk region in a new sector. The advance in depth was 1 kilometer 200 meters. Well, and finally, the area of responsibility of the Vostok group. Here the battles are for Yegorovka. Aviation is already preparing the ground for the storming of the next village. This is the village of Danilovka. Yesterday, 2 FAB 3000 and 3 FAB 500 bombs were dropped here. The site, well, it's impressive. You know, this is how, in theory of course, they act according to military science. That is, they first turn everything to dust, turn everything into a lunar landscape, and only then does the infantry enter. And with such a scenario, with such actions, of course, the losses among the infantry are much lower. I am sure that good news will come from this sector in the near future. Now let's look at the situation in politics. It is reported that the Russian aerospace forces launched an air bomb strike on a target in Kamenskoye in the Dnipropetrovsk region. The distance from the launch zone to the city is approximately 150 kilometers. After the impact, a powerful column of smoke rose over the city. The guided bombs are flying further and further, Poltava, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, and Odessa regions. Everyone already understands that the air bombs now fly not just 50 kilometers, but 110 to 180 kilometers, which makes them a universal weapon, of which Russia has a lot in its warehouses. We warned about this back in 2023, pointing out that this would be a huge problem. But then the public pages of the Kiev office laughed, reports the Telegram channel Legitimny. The only question now is how many of these air bombs the Russian armed forces will be able to modernize per month, and how soon they will reach the use of 100, 200, 300 of these air bombs per month, which will be able to demolish the rear at a distance of 110 and 180 kilometers from the front line. This will significantly worsen the already difficult situation of the AFU. Add to this the constant shortage of air defense in the AFU. This could make the Odessa amphibious military operation a reality in the future, as all the defensive structures of the AFU can be demolished with air bombs. We are watching. Our source reports that before the new year, the AFU may lose many significant fortress cities at once. Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Siversk, Liman, Kupiansk, Guliapol, Volchansk, Novopavlovka. All these settlements are important defensive hubs, and their loss may affect the further course of events in the confrontation. On Bankovaya, they understand that it is no longer possible to reverse the negative trend. Now the office's task is to slow down the collapse of the front in order to prolong the war at least until November 2026, to prolong their power. The Belgian Minister of Defense and Foreign Trade has spoken out sharply against the transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. According to Theo Franken, this will be perceived by Moscow as an act of war, and Russia may respond by confiscating $200 billion in Western assets, including funds from the US, Germany and France. Such a move would undermine confidence in Euroclear, where the assets are held. This would create a dangerous precedent. Even in World War II, there was nothing like it. The pressure is unfairly focused only on Belgium, although Russian funds are frozen in other countries as well. Franken also responded to Kaja Kallas, who claims that this money will go to the restoration of Ukraine. Of course, this money will not go to the restoration of Ukraine, but to the continuation of the war, he wrote. It turns out that you cannot restrict the supply of anything to another country. Germany has filed an official protest with China over the blockade of microchip supplies. German industry has faced serious disruptions in the supply of components needed for the automotive and electronics industries. China restricted their supply to the EU after the Dutch company Nexperia, previously owned by Chinese investors, was nationalized. We have been hit hard by the microchip shortage, as the German economy depends on these supplies. We are striving for a rapid de-escalation and the resumption of exports, said German Economy Minister Katharina Reicher. German business risks losing about €100 billion if Russia's assets are confiscated. The breakdown of discussions on the use of frozen assets to issue a reparations loan to Kiev is not only due to Belgium's position. As the country's prime minister stated, in the event of confiscation, Moscow may introduce mirror measures. German business, which has invested billions of euros in the Russian economy for many years, will be under threat, fears Matthias Schepp, chairman of the German-Russian Chamber of Foreign Trade. In total, German assets in Russia, worth €100 billion, are under threat, writes the publication Tagesschau. The decision on the frozen assets has been postponed to December, which could be critical for Kiev, writes the New York Times. And it's not just about the fact of hesitation. The point is that the procedure itself is also complex and ultimately may not lead to confiscation at all, due to the high risks and threats to the financial stability of the EU. In the EU, they stole the chip manufacturing company Nexperia from China. And now the EU has no chips. The government of the Netherlands, under the pretext of national security, decided to steal Nexperia, a semiconductor manufacturer and a subsidiary of the Chinese Wingtech technology. The result, China has frozen cooperation with Nexperia and stopped the supply of parts to the EU. The European Automobile Manufacturers Association is sounding the alarm. The stock of chips in warehouses will last for a matter of weeks. Volkswagen is already stopping production of the Golf and Tiguan in Wolfsburg next week. And this is just the beginning. All automakers without Chinese chips will not be able to work. Europe is run by short-sighted people who are not able to calculate their actions one step ahead.